So I caught the guy who broke my solar panel system. And so of course I'll explain all that, but you know, this is a vlog, so I got to do the vlog thing and talk about off-grid. As you know, Carolyn asked me to move these solar panels up the hill. Just give you a little bit of a history here. Now, it was only 10 feet. You can see this patchy area. And so I just moved it kind of up here, which increased the hours in which we get sunlight by about 2. We got trees over here on the east side when the sun comes up, so we weren't getting any sunlight on solar panels till 11 a.m. Now we can get sunlight onto the solar panels around 9:30 a.m. on those. And of course, back there I just got 2 new ones, and I can get sun on those around 8:30. So those 2 up there give me 10 amps. So that's 200 watts for that 1 hour. Yeah, it's pretty good actually. This has been a real learning experience, and as a matter of fact, there was a guy who emailed me, and I really would like to help him out, but I just don't know enough about what he's got, and it would be a massive amount of communication. But I'm starting to understand why people are struggling putting in their own solar panels. Now, he has a 100 amp charge controller, which is pretty good. My charge controller was 60 amps. Turns out it was 40 amps. Long story, don't want to get into that again, but Amazon kind of falsely advertised. So I ended up getting a second charge controller, same kind as I had before. So now I have a total between the 2 of 80 amps possible. So I have 1,200 watts of solar panels. But you got to know more about your solar panels. So I got 1,200 watts. Well, what does that mean? Well, you can mathematically figure all this out. My solar panels produce 20 volts. Even though it goes into a 12 volt system, it produces 20 volts. Typically, when you have a solar panel, it produces more volts than what you need. The new MPPT charge controllers, much better than the old ones. The old ones would waste voltage. So you have a 20 volt panel or a 14.4 volt charge controller, you're wasting almost 6 volts. But with the MPPT charge controller, it takes those extra 4 volts and converts them into amps. So it's a much better system. So I recommend getting the MPPT. Just go ahead and spend the extra money, because you're just losing electricity using the old-fashioned one. Now, it took me a long time to learn that back in the early 2000s when I first set up my first panels, and they only had the old kind. They didn't have the MPPT. At least I didn't know of them, or if they did, it was just way too expensive for me. When I installed these, I had to learn a lot about the MPPT. But that just simply meant that I needed to read and watch YouTube videos and try to understand. So these panels produce 20 volts. Well, how does that convert into watts? Well, it doesn't yet. The panel also produces 5 amps. So 20 times 5, 20 volts times 5 amps equals 100 watts. He has a 100 amp system. I'm assuming it's a 14.4 volt charge controller. So he says he has a variety of solar panels. He's got a 400 watt solar panel. He's got a few solar panels like mine, which I guess are 100 watts. And he's got some of these roll up kind. They're actually pretty flexible. I think they're called flexible solar panels. And he's got several of those. And he wants to know if he can hook them all up into his charge controller. I just don't know. I mean, I would assume he can, but I don't know enough about anything that he has provided me. I asked him for pictures, and he told me about this clamp, that there's an alligator clamp on one of the solar panels or something. Anyway, it was just way too confusing to understand what was going on. It is better for me to teach you volts, amps, and watts than it is for you to come to me. And I fear that's what everybody's going to do is, well, I just can't understand it, so I'm not going to try to understand it, so I'm just going to email somebody and let them tell me if I can do it. What you got to do is you got to figure out how many volts your panels are. And can your charge controller accept those volts? I mean, do you have a 24 volt charge controller? As a matter of fact, my charge controller, I believe, is 12 or 24. It detects which your system is. As soon as you understand how many volts your largest panel produces, your largest voltage panel, then that's what your system is going to regulate itself off of. Then you go over to amps and you calculate the amps of each solar panel. So assuming you have a 12 volt solar panel, which converts up to 20, and you have 400 watt solar panels. So 20 volts times 20, so 20 times 20, 20 volts times 20 amps would equal 400 watts. So that means your one panel, I'm just assuming, is 20 volts, and I'm just assuming it's 20 amps. So that one panel is 20% of your charge controller. You have a 100 amp charge controller, so 20 amps. So then you just have to figure out what the rest of your solar panels are. Now, you said you had 2 of them like mine. Well, mine are 20 volts times 5 amps, so that's 10 more amps. So now you got the 20 from the 400, and you got 10 from these 2, so that's 30% of your charge controller. And so then you just got to figure out what the roll-up amps are. And you just add them all together. If it comes under 100, then you have enough charge controller, assuming everything that I've said is true. But you have to understand the basics. It's just that important. You have to understand it. You have to understand volts times amps equals watts. I have 2 systems basically going into one battery bank. I have 800 amp hours of lead acid batteries. That being said, I actually only have 400 usable amp hours, because lead acid batteries, you can only run down 50%. But when we're charging the batteries, we can look at it as 800 amps. When we're discharging, we have to look at it as 400 amps. So when we're charging, I have the max capacity on the batteries. So I have 2 systems going into one battery bank. I have 6 solar panels going into one charge controller, and I have 6 solar panels going into the other charge controller. So that is 30 amps going into each charge controller, giving me a total going into the battery bank at 60 amps. That's how many solar panels I have. Now, I've learned having these 2 charge controllers is better than having 1 charge controller, and I've talked about that in yesterday's video, and I'll put an up next box at the end of this video to that video. But briefly, what I discovered is 1 charge controller will only put in 25 amps into a battery. My charge controllers, I think, there's no evidence to this other than my observations, it will only put 25 amps in, even though my solar panels can produce more than that. Because a 100 amp hour battery, you can only put 25 amps into. The math is, you only put 25% of your battery's capacity. So if you have a 50 amp hour battery, then you can only put in, 12 amps, whatever 20% is, but it's about 12 amps, 12.5, somewhere around there. So it's 25% of the battery's capacity. So my assumption is my charge controller believes that it's running into a 100 amp hour battery. What I would like to see my charge controller do is be able to program how many amp hours I actually have, because I have 800. Then I would only need 1 charge controller. But there's also another scenario. As your battery charges, it charges from 12.3, that's 50% of your battery's capacity, up to 14.4 volts. So 12.3, and then when it's charged is at 14.4. Well, at the same time, when your voltage is low and you're charging, it's going to charge high amperage. And then it starts to, I wish I had 2 hands, you would see the other hand going up as this hand's going down. Let's say you're at 13.6 volts. So you're about halfway charged. That means your amps have dropped halfway also. Having 2 charge controllers though, my amps, I'm getting the same amount of amps from both charge controllers. So if one charge controller is, let's say it's 15 amps, and the other charge controller is at 15 amps. So now I'm getting my total 30 amps out of it versus just the 15. Now I also do this with battery chargers. I can run 2 battery chargers at the same time, and you'll see the same thing happen. Both battery chargers are producing the same amount of amperage as the battery voltage increases as it's charging. So the amperage is dropping, but they're dropping both at the same time, so I'm getting double the amperage. So I feel like the more charge controllers you have, the better you are at charging batteries. Now, there's this other idea also, is when you have a heavy load on it, 1 charge controller is enough. If your charge controller can accept all the amps from your solar panels, one charge controller is enough, because the charge controller can sense whether it's charging batteries or if it's running a load. When I run the well, my charge controller maxes out. I had 50 amps. Before I got the extra charge controller, I had 50 amps of solar panels, but I only had 40 amps of charge controller, so it would max out at 40 as soon as I turned the well on. But as soon as I shut the well off, the charge controller sensed that it no longer had a load, dropped it down to 25 amps, and charged it from 25 amps, whereas I'm still getting 50. Since I'm so heavily reliant on batteries, because we run the freezer at night, I gotta have completely fully charged batteries. When the sun is no longer charging the batteries, they gotta be fully charged so I can get through the night with the freezer. Also, we run some fans. Now Carolyn's son is here, he runs fans also, so we got to make sure we got enough energy to get through the night. So it's critical that I'm getting the batteries charged. So on cloudy days like this, I want to make sure that I'm getting all the amps that I can into the... Now I'm still learning. Now that I got all this hooked up with 2 charge controllers, I'm not sure what it's capable of doing. So this morning I woke up, it was raining and cloudy, so I went ahead and ran the generator. And I ran it for a good long while. Long story, I'll explain what happened. Then I decided, you know what, I'm just going to let the solar panels do the rest. And if it's not charged by tonight, then I'll just start the generator back up, charge them tonight before I go to bed. But what I'm seeing is I really didn't need to run the generator. As a matter of fact, I even filled the IBC tank just a little bit from the well, and that draws 800 watts an hour. We're still getting a good charge even though it is terribly cloudy today. So I'm still learning. I should have just let the solar panels do what they were going to do today so I could learn something. And if it didn't charge them, then I could have just ran the generator tonight. That would have saved some gas. Lesson learned. So next time it's cloudy, I'll just let the solar panels do their job. And if it doesn't do enough, then I'll run it at that night. So this morning, I get up 5 o'clock in the morning, start the generator, and I hook my battery charger onto my batteries. And I go about my day. I didn't think anything of it. Well, it was raining. Still didn't think anything of it. In 2 hours, I came back down because it didn't sound like the generator was running fast enough. The more amps the battery charger takes, the faster the generator runs. So I come down here and I look at it, and the alligator clip to the negative side of my battery charger, I guess, got hot. And it melted and bent out and snapped, and then the alligator clamp just came off the battery. I'm not sure why it got hot, other than maybe, I don't know, these cheap battery chargers, but I'm glad it did what it did. It melted and popped off. That was actually a pretty good safety feature. It would not have caught on fire. If it had caught on fire, it would have just shut off. But then I looked at my new charge controller and the light was on. When I woke down here at 5 o'clock this morning, I would have thought that if the backlight on the charge controller had been on, I would have saw it because it was been pretty bright in there. That was on the new charge controller. The old charge controller was not acting funny. So I looked at it. It was flashing the display erratically. There was something definitely wrong with it. So I immediately started unplugging everything. I unscrewed the solar panels from it first, and there's a sequence to it. You got to do it this way. You unplug the solar panels, and then you unplug the batteries from it. And then when you get ready to plug it back in, you plug the batteries in first and then the solar panels. I unplugged it, plugged the batteries back in, and briefly the screen showed the way it was supposed to be, briefly. And then it went back to this flashing of whatever it was. Well, I put my hand on top of it and it was wet. I guess the camper, the old truck camper, has a leak in it, and I just didn't know it. I mean, it's really starting to fall apart. I mean, I understand that, but I got tarps on top of it just in case there's any leaks, but apparently one of the tarps is leaking too, and it leaked right on top of the charge controller. The reason I don't think I knew it was leaking, because in the camper, we had an old shower stall assembled, so the floor is coroplast. So if it's wet, it just drains off into the drain. Well, this charge controller was $100, and I told you in a previous video the nightmare I had trying to get my solar panels from FedEx, and it was I knew if I had to order a new charge controller that it was going to take another week to get here. which is a problem because that means 6 of my solar panels would have been disconnected from the system, or I would have had to rewire it and put it all into one charge controller. I took it up there to the house with me, and I unscrewed the whole thing. Every screw that was in it, I took out. And I took a little piece of toilet paper and I dried it all off the best I could. Then I put it in front of a fan for an hour. My hope was that little flash that I saw, that it was working correctly, would work. So I waited the hour, I reassembled the whole thing, I brought it back down here, and it's working perfectly. At first, the backlighting, because you can light it up, the backlighting had a shaded area to it. And I thought, well, that's not a huge issue. I mean, I would rather it be nice and bright like it used to be, but it keeps me from having to buy a new one. But that cleared up too. Now it's perfectly fine. So everything's working, and I tell you, that was so disheartening after getting all the components, finally arguing with FedEx, them calling me up and saying, well, you can't live off grid today. So I took some Coroplast and I built a kind of a lean-to over it. You got to keep it ventilated. You don't want to get it where it can't get any air, but I put a little lean-to over it, so if the camper leaks again, it'll stay dry. But we got to get out of this camper soon. Carolyn just put together the shed. We're going to get some paint tomorrow, actually, for the floor, and then we'll get everything transferred over to the shed sometime this summer. Yeah, this camper's on its last leg. It served its purpose very well. It did a great job, and it showed the critics up. That's the important thing. So if you'll click this up next box, it'll take you to that video I was talking about, how I hooked up all these solar panels. So I hope I can inspire you. If it's broke, you can't break it any worse. So tear into it so you can live your dreams. Thanks for watching.